On April 8, 2026, a single government directive landed in inboxes across every French ministry, and it has been reverberating through boardrooms from Redmond to Brussels ever since. France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, DINUM, ordered all the 5 million French civil servants off Microsoft Windows and onto Linux. Not a pilot program, not a vague aspiration. A formal mandate with a reporting deadline of autumn 2026, covering not just the desktop operating system, but collaboration tools, cloud infrastructure, AI platforms, and antivirus software simultaneously. This is the biggest government migration away from Windows any Western democracy has ever announced. And it didn't arrive alone. By the time France made that announcement, Germany's Schleswig-Holstein had already completed 80% of its 30,000 workstation Linux migration. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs had been running on LibreOffice and Linux since late 2025. The German federal government had just mandated that only open document formats would be accepted in official government communications, effectively ruling Microsoft Word out of federal workflows. A European Parliament petition calling for an official EU Linux distribution had been formally received. And on June 3, 2026, the European Commission proposed the Cloud and AI Development Act, a legislative package explicitly designed to bar Amazon, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud from the most sensitive EU government contracts. This is not a story about Linux nerds winning an argument on a forum. It's a story about geopolitics, money, and a legal clause that US Congress passed in 2018 that is currently dismantling decades of Microsoft's most reliable revenue. We have all of it sourced. Let's get into it. To understand why 2026 specifically became the hinge year for this story, you have to understand what changed in Washington, D.C. in January 2025, because none of the European moves we just listed happened in isolation from American politics. When the Trump administration took office, one of its earliest digital policy moves was a February 2025 White House memorandum on defending American companies and innovators from overseas extortion and unfair fines and penalties. The memo targeted countries including France, Austria, Italy, and the UK for implementing digital services regulations, explicitly framing European tech regulation as an attack on American sovereignty and threatening tariff retaliation. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio both publicly criticized the EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act as weapons against American companies. The Trump administration's April 2025 Liberation Day tariffs, which imposed sweeping duties across multiple sectors, only deepened the fracture. The effect in Europe was the opposite of what the White House intended. Rather than softening European regulatory posture, the open pressure campaign convinced a critical mass of European policymakers that the dependency on American technology infrastructure was now a geopolitical liability rather than a merely technical one. Dutch parliamentarians formally urged their government to move away from U.S. cloud services in March 2025. France and Germany convened a joint summit on European digital sovereignty in November 2025, specifically in response to the changed transatlantic relationship. The digital sovereignty conversation that had been running at a policy-wonk temperature in Brussels for years suddenly had the attention of elected officials at the highest level. But the real legal trigger for the June 2026 Cloud and AI Development Act wasn't even a 2025 development. It was a 2018 American law, the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, the Cloud Act, which requires any U.S. incorporated company to hand over data it controls to U.S. law enforcement, regardless of where that data is physically stored. A contractual promise that data will remain on European servers does not override a valid U.S. warrant. In European Commission proceedings, Microsoft's own legal representatives acknowledged they could not guarantee protection of European data from U.S. government access requests. That acknowledgement is cited in the legislative record behind CADA. The law that is now restructuring European government cloud procurement didn't require any new policy from Brussels. It just required European officials to finally read the text of an American law that had been in effect for 8 years. There was also a specific incident that focused minds in a way that legal theory alone never could. In May 2025, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor found himself locked out of his Microsoft email account. The circumstances were disputed. Microsoft denied having taken deliberate action, but the episode illustrated exactly the kind of dependency risk European officials had been describing in theoretical terms. When a U.S. technology company can, for whatever reason, sever a European judicial official's access to their own communications, the question of whether that dependency is acceptable becomes political rather than technical. France's April 2026 directive was the headline, but it landed on top of a foundation that several European countries had been quietly building for years. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein is the benchmark case. In April 2024, the state cabinet formally voted to replace Microsoft Windows and Office across all 30,000 government workstations with Linux, specifically a distribution called +One. Linux, developed in coordination with other German public sector bodies, along with LibreOffice, Nextcloud for file sharing and collaboration, OpenExchange for email and calendaring, and Thunderbird for desktop email. By the end of 2025, the state announced it had successfully completed 80% of that migration. The financial return was immediate. Schleswig-Holstein recorded $15 million in saved licensing fees in 2026 alone. The German Federal Ministry for Digital Transformation and Government Modernization followed with a framework in spring 2026 requiring only open formats like ODF in official documents, effectively closing the door on Microsoft Word as the government standard at the federal level. Another German state, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, simultaneously announced it was adopting Nextcloud as its sovereign collaboration platform, explicitly in alignment with Schleswig-Holstein. Denmark moved at national ministerial level. In June 2025, Caroline Stage Olsen, Denmark's Minister for Digital Affairs, announced that her ministry and its employees would transition away from Microsoft entirely, replacing Windows with Linux and Microsoft Office with LibreOffice. Half the ministry staff completed migration by August 2025, with full implementation by autumn. The Danish motivation was direct. The minister's own statement framed it in terms of dependency. We must never make ourselves so dependent on so few that we can no longer act freely. The ICJ email incident wasn't publicly cited, but Danish digital policy circles were watching it closely. Switzerland went further at the legislative level than any other country, passing a formal law requiring all software developed by the government to be released as open source, while committing approximately $231 million to build a national cloud service designed to keep sensitive government data within Swiss borders. Austria adopted a Digital Austria Act 2, Zero, as the basis for its national digital strategy, and in summer 2025 initiated a charter on digital sovereignty that was subsequently adopted by all 27 EU member states at a continental summit. The Austrian Ministry of Economic Affairs separately migrated approximately 200 staff members from Microsoft 365 to an on-premises platform built around LibreOffice and Nextcloud, hosted entirely on Austrian infrastructure. France itself had the longest track record in this space, even before the April 2026 mandate. The National Gendarmerie completed a migration of 37,000 desktops to a custom Ubuntu-based distribution called Gendubuntu between 2004 and 2013, saving millions in licensing fees and, critically, giving the French state 15 years of proof that large-scale Linux deployment in a government context is achievable. 11 French ministries had already deployed LibreOffice on 500,000 workstations before any formal 2026 mandate existed. The national health insurer, Caisse Nationale d'Assurance Maladie, was already migrating 80,000 agents to sovereign tools, including CHOP for messaging and Visio for video conferencing. The April 2026 directive from DINAM formalizes and accelerates a transition that was already well underway. The municipality of Amsterdam published a multi-year digital autonomy strategy in early 2026, covering a full transition to digital sovereignty by 2035. The city of Lyon is transitioning to Linux and PostgreSQL. Italy's Ministry of Defense has standardized on LibreOffice and ODF for 150,000 PCs. The city of Toulouse saved approximately $1, so $8 million over 3 years, by migrating 90% of its desktops to LibreOffice. The individual country migrations are significant, but the legal framework being built around them is what makes 2026 structurally different from every previous wave of European Linux enthusiasm. On June 3, 2026, the European Commission formally proposed the Cloud and AI Development Act. The core provision, organizations procuring cloud services for EU critical government workloads in banking, energy, healthcare, and public administration, will face a mandatory sovereignty risk assessment before signing any contract. The explicit legal trigger is the Cloud Act. The Commission's own documents name it directly. Because no U.S. incorporated cloud provider can exempt itself from Cloud Act obligations, Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google Cloud cannot, by definition, meet the highest sovereignty tier for the most sensitive EU government contracts, regardless of how many European data centers they build. The European Parliament made its own statement the day after the Commission's announcement. On June 4, 2026, the Parliament replaced Google with Quant, a French search engine, as its default browser search engine across institutional devices. That's a largely symbolic gesture in isolation, but it's a signal about where institutional sentiment is sitting right now. The legislative pathway for CADA requires approval from all 27 member states and the European Parliament, a process that typically takes 12 to 18 months and frequently reshapes proposals significantly. Ireland and the Nordic member states, where U.S. cloud providers have significant operations and tax bases, have historically argued for softer sovereignty requirements, and those tensions will shape the final text. The Commission exempted private companies from the strictest requirements entirely, limiting the sovereignty tiers to government-sensitive workloads specifically. This is a measured proposal rather than a wholesale ban, but the direction of travel it represents is the clearest signal yet that the structural dependency relationship between European governments and American technology platforms is now formally under legislative review. The honest version of this story has to include what's working against the migration, because the history of European government Linux migrations is not a clean record of success. Munich's Linux project is the most cited cautionary tale. The city migrated 12,600 desktops to Linux over several years, documented savings of $11. 7 million, and then reversed the entire migration in 2017 following a change in political leadership, with critics citing ongoing usability complaints, application compatibility friction, and the argument that Microsoft had offered sufficiently attractive licensing terms to make Windows more competitive again. Vienna, Toulouse, South Tyrol, and several Norwegian municipalities have demonstrated sustainable success with open source transitions. Munich demonstrated that political continuity matters at least as much as technical execution. On-screen, success versus reversal case studies. Application compatibility remains the most practical daily friction point. Browser-based tools have eliminated many Windows-specific dependencies. If your civil servants primarily use email, a browser, and document editing, the transition is genuinely manageable. Where Windows-specific professional software, specialized security tools, or legacy government applications with no Linux equivalent remain in the workflow, migration timelines stretch and support costs rise. The French Dynam mandates phased approach, ministry-level planning by autumn 2026, non-critical systems first between 2026 and 2028, critical systems reviewed based on phase 2 outcomes, reflects exactly this lesson learned from earlier migrations. Big tech lobbying has also intensified significantly around these decisions. The digital industry's lobbying spending in the European Parliament grew from $113 million in 2023 to approximately $151 million by 2026, a 33% increase in 2 years. The Commission's Digital Omnibus package, which ran in parallel to the Tech Sovereignty package, drew criticism from digital rights organizations for weakening some GDPR and AI Act safeguards in ways that aligned closely with industry lobbying positions. The political dynamics inside the European Parliament are genuinely contested, and the outcome of the sovereignty package's legislative passage is not guaranteed. The Microsoft 365 price increase coming in July 2026, up to 16. 7% on some plans is doing some of the sovereignty advocates' work for them. Schleswig-Holstein explicitly cited that increase as further justification for a migration already underway. When the alternative to Linux and LibreOffice becomes Microsoft 365 at 16, 7% more than last year, the financial calculus shifts even for governments that might otherwise prefer to stay with familiar tools. Alongside all of these national migrations, a separate but parallel conversation has been building in Brussels about whether Europe should develop its own common Linux distribution for government use. European Parliament Petition 0729/2024, formerly titled EU Linux, called on the European Union to actively develop and implement a Linux-based operating system across all public administrations in all EU member states, alongside open-source alternatives to Microsoft 365 like LibreOffice and Nextcloud, and a Linux-based mobile OS for government devices. The petition was received and formally processed by the Parliament's Committee on Petitions. It carries 2,474 signatures, modest in number but notable in that it reached the formal EU legislative reception process. On-screen, EU Parliament petition screenshot. The idea isn't as abstract as it sounds. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein is already running a custom distribution called +One. Linux developed for government use. France's Gendarmerie has run Genbuntu for 15 years. The Eurostack initiative, launched in March 2025 and backed by the Bertelsmann Stiftung and the Center for European Policy Studies, proposed a structured European alternative to American digital infrastructure across cloud, AI, and operating system layers. These aren't theoretical proposals. They're building blocks that a formal EU Linux program could consolidate rather than invent from scratch. The counter-argument, worth taking seriously, is fragmentation. Europe already has multiple government Linux distributions in development across multiple countries. A common EU standard that works for the German civil service, the French national health insurer, and a Danish municipal government simultaneously is an enormously complex coordination challenge. The history of EU-level technology standardization projects has a mixed record. But the political will behind the idea is measurably higher in 2026 than it has ever been. And that shift happened in roughly 18 months, driven primarily by geopolitical forces rather than technical ones. Let's close with the numbers that matter for anyone tracking this as a business and technology story rather than a policy one. French government contracts represent a substantial portion of Microsoft's European enterprise revenue. A 5 million device migration, even phased over 5 to 7 years at the Denim's own estimated cost range of $1. $5 billion to $3 billion produce eliminates one of the largest Windows enterprise contracts on the continent. If Germany and Italy, both of which have signaled interest in parallel moves, follow through as current discussions suggest, the cumulative device count across European governments enters the tens of millions. On screen, European government Linux migration timeline. Linux's global desktop share has climbed from 2.76% in mid-2022 to approximately 7% by 2025 according to StatCounter, a more than 70% increase in 3 years. The United States crossed 5% for the first time in June 2025. France currently operates over 103,000 Ubuntu workstations. Europe as a whole has historically maintained desktop Linux adoption above the global average, driven by exactly the kind of government deployment activity we've been covering. Mark Shuttleworth, CEO of Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, called France's announcement a demonstration that digital sovereignty is not just rhetoric. Greg Crowe-Hartman, a senior Linux kernel maintainer, observed that what Europe is doing in 2026 is the culmination of decades of steady improvement. Linux on the desktop is no longer a punchline. It is a legitimate choice for organizations that prioritize security, flexibility, and independence from vendor lock-in. The caveat that any honest analysis has to include: the desktop OS layer is the most visible part of this migration, but it sits above a cloud and compute substrate that remains predominantly American. Even as France replaces Windows with Linux, the 12 European AI startups selected for Amazon's 2026 AWS Pioneers cohort illustrate that Europe's most ambitious technology projects are still being built and scaled on US cloud infrastructure. CADA, if it passes in something close to its proposed form, addresses the government layer. The private sector layer, and the AI compute layer above that, remains a separate, larger, and harder problem. Europe's open source revolution didn't start on April 8, 2026, and it won't end with a single French directive. What April 8th represents is the moment a conversation that had been running at policy temperature for 20 years crossed into mandatory implementation language at the level of a major Western government. The gendarmerie proved it was achievable 15 years ago with 37,000 desktops. Schleswig-Holstein proved it was achievable at state scale last year. France has now applied the same logic to an entire national civil service of 5 million. The honest question is sustainability. Munich's reversal in 2017 is still cited in every serious analysis of this story because it demonstrates that political will is a variable, not a constant. CADA still needs all 27 member states and the European Parliament to agree. The big tech lobby is spending more in Brussels than it ever has, and the cloud layer underneath all of these Linux desktops will remain a contested battleground long after the desktop migration question is settled. What's different this time, genuinely, measurably different, is the geopolitical forcing function. Every previous European Linux push was primarily about cost and ideology. This one has the Cloud Act, the ICC email incident, Trump's February 2020 tariff memo, and a Microsoft 365 price increase all pushing in the same direction simultaneously. That's a different quality of pressure than ideological preference, and it's the kind of pressure that tends to produce durable policy rather than pilot projects. Windows isn't disappearing from Europe, but for the first time in the history of personal computing, the question of whether Windows is the default for the continent's governments has moved from theoretical to actively contested at the highest levels of elected leadership. That's the signal worth tracking. That's the pulse this week. If you want the next Market Pulse report the moment it drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments whether you think Europe's open source push will stick this time or whether we'll be back here in 2030 covering another reversal. We'll see you in the next one.